You're listening to an extract of the Leader podcast. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts. It's been another weekend of knife violence on London streets. A 14-year-old boy was stabbed to death in Newham. A 16-year-old girl has suffered life-changing injuries after a double knife attack in Lambeth. Only last month, an 18-year-old was fatally stabbed outside his home in Walthamstow. In fact, of 33 homicides in London so far this year, 24 have involved knives. And Scotland Yard admits that with lockdown easing, they expect the violence to get worse. So what are they doing about it? They've launched Operation Sceptre, which will put extra patrols out on London streets. I'm joined now by the Evening Standard's John Dunne, who's covering the story. And John, knives seem to be prevalent across the city.
That seems to be the case. There's a prevalence. Young people do carry knives. Many say they carry them for self-defense, but the argument to that is that we can't have young people with knives in their pockets or in their belts to defend themselves. It's not a healthy way for society to go forward. And knife crime figures have been high over a number of years. And the problem doesn't seem to be improving.
So this is not a new problem, is it, though? What's different this time?
Well, this morning I spoke to the commander in charge of Operation Sceptre, and he said explicitly that he sees knife crime as the biggest problem facing the Met at the moment. More resources are being piled into it. This week, knife arches will be set up outside stations. There'll be more stop and searches. And police are particularly interested in searching or identifying potential drug dealers carrying knives and operating county lines operations. There seems to be a real will and a bit of extra resource being put into trying to tackle this problem, which hasn't been improving for a number of years.
So you've spoken about those knife arch deployments, John. What are those, and what other things are police doing?
The knife arches are basically portable machines which can detect if someone's carrying a knife. So you could set them outside a train station where there's been a particular problem, or an underground station where there's a particular problem with drug dealing and or knife carrying. And these knife arches will electronically bleep and make police aware that someone's carrying a blade. Hand in hand with this, the police say they're not just going for stop and search and knife arches. They are actually going to schools this week to talk to kids about blades and the dangers of carrying concealed weapons. It's not just a tough crackdown. There's also the educational side to it as well, they want to emphasise.
And you've also spoken to parents of other teenagers who have been murdered in London. What have they been saying, John?
Yeah, there's a feeling of frustration that the problem of knife crime isn't being taken seriously enough. Many of the parents feel that City Hall Mayor Sadiq Khan hasn't really addressed the problem of knife crime and given it the importance that it should have. He claims that he doesn't have the resources to tackle this problem on his own, and that the government have starved him of funding. But there is a feeling among the parents that he needs to be more present and show more leadership in tackling this terrible problem that's blighting the capital.
John Dunne there. You can read his reporting on Operation Sceptre and those interviews with the parents of knife crime victims at standard.co.uk. But will this work? Evening Standard columnist Natasha Mwansa has written about how growing up in Newham, she saw friends of friends get caught up in gang culture. And a decade on, she doesn't think much has changed. She's with me now. Natasha, could something like increasing officers on the street actually affect knife crime?
While I don't disagree that a heavier police presence is needed, especially as sort of dire as the situation is becoming, I do think it can be difficult because, historically, especially ethnic minorities and the Black community have had quite a fraught relationship with the police force and with the Met Police, especially when you look back at things like stop and search and how it's always been skewed more towards, or the belief is that it's always been skewed more towards young Black men. I think that increasing the police force without doing any sort of reform in how the police force engage with these communities could just exacerbate the situation if not monitored properly.
You've written about how there needs to be more research done into this. What kind of research are you talking about? What sort of areas should they be looking at?
I think the research that needs to be done into kind of where and how knife crime can come to be this bad is to do with the communities that are mostly affected and mostly kind of produces these young boys, well, mainly boys, who feel like their only kind of choices in life are to turn towards things like gang activity and sort of postcode wars. I think a lot of the time you'll find that these communities are under-resourced. There aren't many things like community centres. There are opportunities that aren't extended to people, to young people in these areas. And I think when you want to look into what provokes such a bad situation, it's more than just criminalizing people. It's more than just seeing these young people as monsters and murderers. These are very young people. These are teenagers who have things like exams and football and, flirting with their school crush that's what they should be doing with their time as young people. But instead they're engaging in violent activity. There are reasons for this, and a lot of it has to do with the choices that these people are presented with their lives, and a cycle of poverty in many cases that keeps them sort of trapped in this cycle.
Yeah, I think that's perhaps something that isn't really highlighted enough, is that these are perfectly normal teenagers going around perfectly normal lives, getting involved in things like this, and it's hitting the communities really hard because it often comes as a shock, doesn't it?
It does come as a shock a lot of the time, but for the people, and especially the young people living in these communities and trapped within that space, it's not a surprise at all. And you'll find that a lot of people in these areas, and even when I was younger, we all knew someone who was caught up in these sorts of activities. We all had heard of people who had been stabbed, who had been jumped by gangs, who had gone to prison. And it's very much kind of normal in these groups and communities, as well as kind of there are lots of older gang members who are adults who groom these younger boys to kind of take part in this activity. And that's something that needs to be looked at as well.
Is this a city-wide problem, do you feel?
I do feel it's a citywide problem, kind of even just in the way that London is kind of made up. You can very easily have, really expensive houses and townhouses in places like Kensington, and then round the corner there'll be council estates and more sort of under-resourced and underfunded areas. So just by the infrastructure of London, these things, you're never going to find any one specific part of London that isn't affected by it. But it's also affected very much on just when you think of it in a more general sense, it affects us because nobody is safe from it, and nobody, as long as this is an ongoing problem, there will be innocent bystanders who get hurt. There will be people who are there at the wrong place and the wrong time. It's always going to be a case of someone who had nothing to do with this kind of lifestyle but still gets caught up in it regardless.